Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Biology of Superheroes podcast. I'm your host, Shane Campbell Staton. I'm an evolutionary biologist and currently a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow. I came up with the idea for this podcast series as a graduate student at Harvard University, where I taught a class that focused on where the science meets the fiction when it comes to our favorite comic books, sci-fi movies, and TV shows. Now I'd like to expand that conversation and explore the science and the fiction with you. Joining me on this journey is my good friend, co-host, and comic book head, Arian Darby. Arian is a marketing manager at Warner Brothers, also known as the WB, which is home to superheroes like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. On today's episode, we talk about Peter Parker, his superhero alter ego Spiderman, and the biology of his amazing webs. I interviewed Dr. Todd Blackledge, a professor of biology at University of Akron in Ohio, who studies the behavior and biomechanics of web building in spiders. We lean on his expertise to understand the biology of Spider-Man's webs, the limits of their performance, and what scientists in the real world have learned about the truly fascinating innovation that is spider silk. I really hope you're as excited about this series as I am, because the Biology of Superheroes podcast starts now. So today, man, we're gonna talk about Spider-Man.
Cool, classics. I like that.
Yeah, we're gonna do Peter Parker. So there's been a lot done with Spider-Man. They got the new Spider-Man now, Miles Morales, doing his thing. But we're gonna keep it classic on this episode. We might talk about Miles Morales in a later episode. But today we're gonna focus in on Peter Parker.
Classic iterations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Ever since 1962, Peter Parker, the man.
The original.
So Spider-Man's gone through so many iterations. The themes over the decades now, because again, you're talking about 1962 when it premiered the character in the first. I think the first appearance was in Amazing Fantasy number 15, and that was written by Stan Lee and I think drawn by Steve Ditko at the time. But ever since then, the characters, the crux of who the character is, has kind of remained the same throughout the years, and the story and what drives him has relatively remained untouched. But there's been countless kind of variations and approaches to telling the mythology, if you will, whether it's from the big screen down to the comic books. And this idea about continuity in comics is something interesting too, because you can have a lot of different stories of Peter Parker occurring simultaneously throughout the years in different forms of media, even within comic books itself. And so there's never just one story that's the story of Peter Parker. But I think the essence of the character is something that has endured throughout the decades, and that's what makes it such an approachable superhero, and that's why he's lasted now for over 50 years and is continuing to be iterated on for years to come. So that's kind of a quick background in terms of Spider-Man, at least from my perspective, and how I get into it. Spidey is kind of a really cool character because he's got so much going on with some of his abilities and things. And then even just as a person and thinking about what he's been through and kind of having that be relatable, particularly as a young person growing up, there's just so many ways to kind of find an interest in the character. So
yeah. Do you have like a favorite story arc from Spider-Man?
I'm a sucker for just the origin story, man.
Yeah.
And there's just something about the way, I'll say, Marvel in particular kind of sets up their heroes that just feels very grounded and very realistic and very vulnerable. That lets you have a crystal clear indication of who this person is and why they do what they do. And I was even just watching a couple of the older movies not too long ago, and seeing how that take is portrayed. And even though they took a couple of different stabs at it in terms of how they approached it with Tobey Maguire movie versus kind of the more recent Andrew Garfield storyline, it's all there. And how important family is to him, particularly in the loss and absence of his actual parents and the relationship he has with his aunt and uncle.
Yeah.
The friendships that he forms and the people that kind of connect to his life. Just all of the origin, I would kind of say classic origin stuff around Aunt May and Uncle Ben, and some of his childhood friends and some of his childhood, protagonists and the people that he encounters along the way. I think it's just something that's super, super relatable. And when you're growing up and you're facing challenges and, you think about whether or not, do you actually need to be imbued with a sense of power and superpower or whatever to be great in this world? And I think Peter Parker proves that you don't need Spider-Man's abilities or any kind of superpower to be amazing. But I think there is this concept of not limiting your greatness and really being able to come into your own and share that with the world, whatever talent it is that you may have or whatever belief it is that you may have, being able to express that to the fullest extent. You can see in the story that's when Peter's life completely changes.
Yeah.
And he goes from this person that is I wouldn't necessarily say ignored, but it has gone mostly unnoticed in his life, to someone that is dynamic and that just has all these kind of wonderful people around him, and also some challenges. But he's also kind of imbued with a sense of self-confidence that he can do it, and he can kind of rise to the occasion. So.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of great points there. It's like, so I originally got exposed to Spider-Man through the TV series from was it Fox, like the Fox Kids TV series. Like that was my jam back in the day. And one of the things I really dig about Spider-Man and Peter Parker is like he spends a lot of time balancing who he is as Peter Parker, and even before he gets bit by the spider, he's a very academically gifted individual, right? And he's really into science, and then he gets bit by the spider and his life goes into disarray. His obviously, like, his parents aren't in the picture, and that's a tragedy. His Uncle Ben dies, and that's even greater tragedy. And and then he starts slipping academically and kind of goes into a depression and is trying to find himself as an individual. But then, I mean, I would argue that it was actually like finding himself as a scientist was really key to his success, both as Peter Parker and as Spider-Man, right? And, so he gets bit by this radioactive spider, and he gets like all these, awesome powers, but then he has to take it a step further and like use his scientific background to design this super web formula, that he then uses. And I mean, I would argue that's probably one of the most versatile weapons in his arsenal. He's super strong and agile and has got his spidey sense and all that. But, that webbing, like that's, one could argue that's really what makes him the Spider-Man. Like without that, he would be like a slight variation on like Captain America or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Peter would not have. They're not to borrow a Venom term, but there was a definite symbiosis there where like Spider-Man wouldn't have existed without Peter Parker, and Peter Parker wouldn't have existed without Spider-Man in terms of what the hero ultimately became, because of the science and the background that he had, and designing the web formula and designing the cartridges and creating the uniform and iterating on that and improving that and enhancing that, and just having an understanding of how to, at the beginning, scientifically, test his abilities and figure out what works and what doesn't in terms of, his capabilities, and to think about, how to stretch those capabilities beyond where maybe he first thought the limitations were. All of that came from this scientific mind, and again, it's part of pointing back to the fact that he wasn't nothing, quote unquote, before he became Spider-Man at all. Like the kid was a genius. He was a rock star. And you know, that kind of plays out in different ways throughout some of the different comics as well as the movies. You know, like in the original Tobey Maguire movie, he's kind of a straight-laced genius, and the kind of later version with Andrew Garfield, he's sort of more of like an alternative skater kid, but he's also still really smart.
Yeah.
And this newer version that's coming out with Tom Holland, Homecoming in July, it seems like he might have even a bit of a computer science coding background to a certain degree too. And so it's all evolving with the state of the times of everything in terms of just us culturally and societally. But that idea that this kid isn't, you know, this kid's not a joke at all. He's not wasting his potential by any means. He's definitely a smart kid in that he's able to marry the scientific angle with this crazy incident that happens to him is what kind of sparks a lot of the magic of what comes out of the character. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think this was like, I mean, because of basically everything you just said, you know, like the intersection of, you know, science and the character and like the cultural significance. Plus, you know, we got, you know, the newest rendition of Spider-Man coming out. I really wanted to dive into who Spider-Man is, right, as a biological entity, you know, and like obviously there's a lot of stuff that we could potentially dig into. He's got the super strength, he's got agility, spidey sense, all this stuff. But one of the things that really got me with this character is the webbing, right? And you know, so I want to spend this episode really talking about Spider-Man's webbing, like the functional significance of it, the reality of spider webs, you know, and you know how you go about bioengineering. Because I mean, if we break it down, I mean, when we look at Peter Parker, essentially he becomes a bioengineer in order to complete his his persona as Spider-Man. Like he needs this critical component, which is these spider webs. And in order to get that, he actually has to go in and make synthetic webbing. And, you know, so this is something that, you know, that a lot of actual scientists in the real world are thinking about. So so today we're going to dive in and dig into some of the biology of Spider-Man and his crazy webs. So to start off, I wanted to really get an understanding of exactly, you know, like people say like silk all the time, like obviously, like, you know, we wear silk clothes and, you know, and all this, but you know, when we think about silk, it's actually it's a biological product. So I reached out to a professor at University of Akron, Dr. Todd Blackledge, who studies spiders, and so I got his insights into some spider biology and the biology of silks. So I just started out asking him, you know, what exactly is silk from a biological standpoint. So let's see what he had to say.
So there's a lot of different arthropods, spiders and insects and all of their kin that produce silks. And they're basically these fibers of proteins, the same general building blocks as your hair or your skin. These fibrous proteins that have a semi-crystalline structure. So if you could look at them at the kind of nano scale, you'd see that parts of the proteins fold into these tiny, tight little crystals, while other parts are kind of loosely, chaotically wrapped around one another. And that makes these silks both strong and stretchy at the same time. So there's a bunch of different creatures that have evolved the ability to make silks. And spiders are one example. And they have really taken the production of silk to really its highest level, where all of the world's 46,000 species of spiders spin silk threads throughout their lives for a lot of different functions, not just to build webs, but to make safety lines as they move around, or egg cases to protect their eggs, or even little tents that they can retreat to when it's time to molt their skins.
Yeah, so essentially what we see, according to Dr. Blackledge, is that spider webs essentially just proteins that they've used and co-opted for this pretty amazing innovation that they can use for all these different functions.
I mean, you know, just after listening to what Dr. Blackledge said, I think first and foremost, I probably need to watch a little more Discovery Channel, because I I didn't even realize there was multiple species of different animals that produced silk. I was sitting there, and now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, okay, spiders, and I'm like, caterpillars, and then I start drawing a blank, and that's as far as my biology learnings have taken me. But with relation to Peter Parker in particular, I think the key words he used there were strong and stretchy, and we're talking about the science of elasticity, and something that sort of maximizes the properties of both being able to stretch as well as strength in terms of tension and being able to support. Because ultimately, he's saving lives. And the science behind what goes into how he's developed the technology into his own version of silk is literally the difference between life and death, whether it's stopping the bad guy or saving the civilian or even supporting himself as he's swinging through the city. Exactly. So again, it just goes back to his genius from day one, pre-spider bite. It was already there, and that's huge.
Exactly. And one of the things that that I thought was really interesting in Spider-Man: Homecoming is we get this scene where he puts the suit on, and this automated voice in the suit tells him that he has all these different combinations of webbing that he can use for all the for whatever his imagination can come up with. And so that actually got me thinking from a biological standpoint. Spiders themselves actually they have a lot of different tasks to accomplish with these webs as well, from like Dr. Blackledge said, from making these prey capture devices and webs to like their own sort of protective casing, and casing for their eggs and things like that. And it got me wondering, if spiders actually have more than one type of webbing. So let's hear what Dr. Blackledge has to say about that.
So it's a great question. So a typical spider, like an orb weaving spider, has a toolkit of 7 to 8 types of silks that they can produce. So each type of silk is produced in its own gland and is extruded through its own little spigot on the spider's spinnerets. And these silks will have different chemical compositions and different physical properties. Some will be as stretchy as a rubber band, others are ounce for ounce stronger than steel, some are sticky like glue, others are dry. And so spiders really can take these different types of silks and combine them together to make different functional structures.
So we actually see, it seems like spiders they're coming up with a lot of different ways to solve the problems that that Spider-Man is, when he's out stalking the streets of New York.
Again, that was fascinating, and it's almost an endless train of questions that spurn out of what the doctor shared, because it's like, now I'm thinking, which comes first? Is it the chicken or the egg? Is this and I don't know a lot about science, but is this an evolutionary thing where, how does the spider know that it'll need these 7 to 8 different types of silk to produce in its environment? Does it react to things situationally as it develops, and then the glands compensate to basically accommodate that need? Or is it something that's just biologically passed down through the generations of spiders and this this type of spider where you just genetically are kind of gifted with the ability to do this, and it happens to match your environment through evolution?
So I think
science, help me. I don't know what's going on anymore.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Things were so much easier with Peter Parker.
Yeah. So it's one of those things, right, where I think that's a really classic question. It's a penetrating question for evolution. Big part of evolution as a field is asking, how do you get complex things from non-complex beginnings, right? So if we go back through the spider tree, he was saying there's, I think he said 46,000 species, each of which has this really complex innovation, which is like a combination of the proteins themselves that they're producing and this complex organ that they can then use to produce different combinations of these proteins and put together for different functions. Like, how do you get that from nothing? And one of the old sayings is essentially that, evolution is a tinkerer, right? So if you go all the way back through the tree of life to like the single spider ancestor that didn't have silk, maybe there was a very basic beginning to spider silk, and then like just having the very basic beginnings of spider silk and the ability to produce it, the individuals that have those things, they survive and they're better able to function and reproduce, and then their children have that thing. And when you look at generations over generations over generations across millions of years, and you get this really wide diversity of functions associated with this really complex feature that is just incrementally tinkered with, that allows an animal to better fit into a given environment. And as they become better fit, they're able to potentially better specialize for different functions, and slight modifications of the tools that they're using, like their spinnerets and silk, they become even further modified. So it's sort of this feedback loop that plays out generation after generation.
Because it's interesting, you mentioned that evolution is the ultimate tinkerer, and I guess you could say in the comic book world, to a certain degree, maybe there's Reed Richards or someone that might challenge him, but I'd say Peter Parker is also one of the ultimate tinkerers, in the sense of he's come up against a lot of different challenges where maybe his current system and his current web formula doesn't work, and he has to put something together specially to stop a new rival that he's not quite prepared for, somebody like the Sandman or something, or some of these other enemies that he's encountered where his normal tricks and tactics don't work, and so he goes literally back into the lab to try and figure out scientifically what it's going to take to actually take this next rival down. Yeah. So that's interesting that he's a tinkerer as well from a scientific perspective.
Yeah, and I think that that mimics real world scientists. I mean, there's this idea of biomimicry, right? This entire field of engineers and biologists and chemists that are using the innovations that evolution has come up with that we can see in the natural world. They take those things and bring them into the lab, and they try to understand how we can apply those to real world apply those for real world solutions, that we need. And you see that in a lot of, everything from adhesion, like using things like gecko toe pads to develop adhesives, to using, different types of desert beetles, like how they design, how their exoskeleton is designed has been used to design water bottles that are able to wick water out of desert air environments, so that people that are stuck in really arid environments can get water in the same way that those beetles that have evolved in those habitats have. So this idea of human curiosity and human tinkering, taking advantage of of the biological tinkering that evolution has done in the wild, generation after generation over millions of years. I mean, in that sense, I think those two ideas match perfectly. And so that so now we have this diversity of thousands upon thousands of spiders. So it brings the question, like, who's the best at it, right? Like, where if we're talking about silk strength, right? If we just take that aspect of it, I mean, because so much of Spider-Man's, so many of the feats that he has to use, with his webbing, is based on the strength of that webbing, right? To be able to like stop a really strong opponent. I think in one, I remember in one issue of Spider-Man, he's actually able to, to restrain the Hulk for some period of time using his webbing. Like takes a ridiculous amount of strength, So thinking about him as an engineer, like a bioengineer, like, is there a species that he would go to get inspiration about designing his own artificial silks? So I asked Dr. Blackledge. I talked to him a little bit about one extreme example of a spider that produces an incredibly strong silk. And I imagine that if Peter Parker were actually designing a web formula that allowed him, to restrain extremely strong foes or like stop trains, this might be the species that he would use as inspiration. Recently, I've been reading about a really special species that you've worked on, which is the Madagascar Darwin's bark spider. And it seems like this particular spider seems to go like above and beyond in terms of like the strength of its webbing. Can you tell me a little bit about like how was this species discovered? What is it using this really extremely strong web for? Like, why does it need such a strong web? Can you tell me a little bit about the evolution and ecology of the species?
So certain kinds of silk. So the dragline silk of an orb weaving spider, that's what most people think of when they think of spider silk in a classical sense. That's the very strong structural thread in a lot of webs. It is ounce for ounce stronger than steel. But what's really important compared to steel is that it's also very stretchy. If you think about breaking a thin steel wire, as soon as you pull it a little bit, it's really hard to pull it, but as soon as you pull it a little bit, it'll fail. It'll fall apart. Spider silk, you have to keep pulling it harder and harder and harder and harder until it stretches about 20 to 40% of its length before it breaks. And that makes it very tough. That means it takes a lot of work to break it. It's not just a strong but brittle material. That's what's really spectacular about spider silk, is this combination of strength and stretchability. Now, what Darwin's bark spider has done under some conditions is made a silk that can maintain that high strength as it stretches even further than typical orb weaver's silks do. And that makes it very, very tough.
So how is this species, because this species was only relatively recently described, maybe 10 years ago?
Yeah, it wasn't quite 10 years ago. So it was described by my colleagues E. Agnerson and Maciej Kuntner, and they have both traveled the world discovering new species of spiders for a very long time. And they knew about the existence of these big webs, these large spiders out in Madagascar. And we were chatting one day at a scientific conference about what kinds of conditions would be likely to make spiders evolve better performing silks, essentially. Mm-hmm. And talking a little bit about how there's this trend in traditional orb weaving spiders where the bigger species actually produce a little bit better quality silk than smaller species. And we were thinking, maybe, well, as you get a bigger web, it's harder to catch faster moving insects, so maybe you evolve some better performing silk. And that got us thinking about, well, what would be kind of the extreme of that situation? And of course, they thought of these giant webs out in Madagascar. Mm-hmm. And so we were able to get the funding for them to go to Madagascar, collect the spiders, bring them back to the laboratory, and actually begin to investigate their silks.
So one of the things I think is really incredible about Darwin's bark spider, right? It's like so now, as far as we know, we have this one extreme example, right? So like the one species of spider that produces the strongest silk, not only the strongest silk, but the strongest biomaterial that we know of in the entirety of the natural world. And I think that that's an absolutely phenomenal idea, especially given that, it was discovered less than 10 years ago at this point in this really remote region of the world, Madagascar.
Scientists are everywhere, apparently. That's the first thing I took away from that. I was like, who's in Madagascar, just generally speaking? And then who's out there doing science, specifically with spiders? And it's like, here's the thing that we all wanted to know and find in nature to study. So I'm not entirely surprised that it has only been discovered 10 years ago. But if you told me no one knew yet, I wouldn't be surprised either, because if it's hiding out on Madagascar, man, that's incredible that people are even able to find it. But again, I think it just speaks to how influential nature's design is for us, and how so many of our best ideas are inspired by it. Yeah. And just kind of hearing the kind of, I guess, elasticity potential and how well the strand would hold up relative to steel, where when you begin to start stretching steel, it's going to break apart fairly quickly. But I think the doctor mentioned that this will hold 20 to 40% of its, in addition to its original length. So you have to stretch it way beyond its original which you would think its original capacity would be before you start to see a breakdown and a failure. And it's exciting to think that people are studying this and also hopefully potentially figuring out ways in which we can use it to enhance our own lives.
Yeah. So I think you brought up two great points there, right? I mean, one is that like now we actually, we have this really awesome place to go to find a potential solution, right? I mean, there's so many scenarios where you can imagine like having a very strong, very resilient fiber could be extremely useful, right? I mean, you could find potential military, uses for that, potential medical uses for that, just like everyday engineering uses for that, like building skyscrapers or any number of things, like towing really heavy objects. And now we have this really extreme example that we can go to and learn from. And the second thing is, I don't think that there are very many circumstances where someone would come up with the question, it's like, how do we solve this problem? Like, what is the best way, to make a really strong fiber, and then immediately say, oh, let's go to Madagascar to find that out, right? So you bring up this point that, I mean, there's like this basic exploration factor that's associated with it. Like, you never know, like when people think about science, they think about it as something that happens in a straight line, right? It's like you start at point A and it's like, oh, we want to solve this problem. And then we go to point B and it's like, oh, let's solve this other problem. And we go to point C. But science many times just doesn't work like that, right? It's this sort of meandering, exploratory thing. You go out and you ask some questions, but then the answers that you get may lead you down another road. One of the things that Dr. Blackledge was saying was that this whole conversation, about these bark spiders started because they were studying their behavior in this web building, and then that led them to questions of web strength. And and now we have, because of that exploration, right, that sort of these basic questions of ecology and evolution, like now we have this extreme example that we can potentially put to use for all sorts of applications. So one of the things that moving forward with this brings up this whole idea of bioprospecting, especially now because many of these places, including Madagascar, are being stripped of a lot of their biodiversity because of agriculture, because of deforestation. A lot of these regions around the world that we know very little about are under threat because of human-mediated climate change. So I asked Dr. Blackledge a little bit about sort of what this could potentially mean for bioprospecting, right? Finding these extreme innovations from the natural world.
Yeah, I think it's a really important idea. So when you think about the rate at which extinction's occurring across the globe, we don't really have the time to let random chance find these incredible discoveries out in nature. The scientific community kind of has to be as smart as it can to discover these kind of extraordinary materials, extraordinary properties and chemicals and things like that are out in some of these species in very threatened parts of the world. And so if we can become somewhat more predictive about how we're exploring the natural world for some of these treasures, we might be able to find them before they go extinct.
So as you see, man, our ability to make these discoveries and make these sorts of innovations is really dependent on scientists around the world being able to actually do the basic research. And, with the current, threats of climate change and, deforestation, I mean, a lot of those innovations may have already been lost. Like, who knows, what, things that have gone extinct that, we had yet to discover or had yet to ask the right questions about.
It's interesting to hear, and you touched upon this a little bit earlier about just the proactiveness of how scientists need to be utilizing their curiosity. So again, it's not just sitting in the lab at home reading through the textbooks or theorizing. It's about literally getting out into nature and evaluating those ideas and testing your hypotheses and looking for clues in certain instances to answers or to questions that you didn't even know you were out there in the first place for, and it can lead you down a completely different path, and that's fine because thankfully, I think from an outsider's perspective, it seems like the global scientific community is more than willing to kind of come to the aid of a great discovery. And if you happen to stumble upon something that isn't your expertise, I think the scientific community isn't sitting there on these expeditions and saying, well, I came out here for like spider string and silk, but I found something about this gecko, but whatever, not my thing. So we'll just leave that in Madagascar, and hopefully somebody else will find that before this gecko becomes extinct. No, they're taking that finding and they're probably passing it along to their colleagues or someone who they know is an expert in the field, and that research and that mantle is likely being picked up and taken forward. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I mean that's I think you hit on a key point, and that one of the ways that science progresses is through sharing of information, right? I mean that's what the whole field is about. There's one thing that we say as scientists is, the research isn't worth anything unless people know what you've done, right? Unless you publish. And the entire process of science is about building on the findings of those before you, right? Trying to find an intersection, like maybe there was, maybe there were two scientists who studied seemingly unconnected things, and then someone finds the connection between them, right? And that starts a whole different trajectory. We see that a lot. Bioprospecting is one of those examples where you take engineers that are trying to design optimal materials for different things, and you take biomechanics, people who are studying, the properties of organisms and how they function. You bring those two things together, and now you have this entire field of bio-inspired engineering.
It's really cool.
Yeah, and this is something that we also see, again, like bringing it back to Spider-Man. We see this mimicked a lot in the Spider-Man story arc, right? I mean, we see like Oscorp as a company, right? They are essentially a bio-inspired company, right? They have their fingers at, like, they're the ones who modified the spiders, that one of which that bit Peter Parker, that turned him into Spider-Man, which was
right.
Which was also like an unforeseen outcome of that research. They they're doing a lot of things in robotics, which ended up with Dr. Octopus going rogue with his robotic arms. They're doing stuff in like biomedical stuff with like cellular regeneration, that caused Dr. Connors to become the Lizard, right? So they're producing a lot of
stuff as well.
Huh?
Doctor with Osborn himself, military stuff with the glider and everything, aerodynamics and all that. And
exactly, and the super steroid that turns him into the Green Goblin. Right.
Yep.
I mean, they're producing a lot of supervillains with their work, but they're actually coming up with some pretty innovative stuff. So the last thing I wanted to talk with Dr. Blackledge about is like just get his take on Spider-Man, right? And get his perspective, his biological perspective of what they've done with the character in the Marvel universe. So let's hear what he has to say about that.
Well, it's all really fun to watch, of course, and sort of in the broad sense, spiders do a lot of the same things with their silks, but the devil's really in the details, and spiders do it in a very different way. So, of course, Spider-Man has these silk shooters on his wrists that seem to do all these different kinds of silks out of the same nozzle, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Spiders are producing their silks out of different little spigots. They have an individual nozzle for each type of silk. They also can't actually shoot their silk the way Spider-Man does. That'd be really cool if they could. Mm-hmm. But the silk is pulled out of these spigots. And so that means that these spiders in Madagascar, they aren't shooting silk 80 feet across rivers to make the bridge line for their webs. Instead, they have to let the silk drift out on any breeze or even the warming of the earth from the morning sun provides enough convection to carry a silk thread somewhere. And so it'll blow somewhere, but they can't shoot it.
In terms of like that webbing being able to withstand his body weight or being able to stop a train, do you think realistically spider silk could accomplish those feats?
Oh, absolutely. Spider silk can easily do those kinds of tensile feats, so to speak. So just lifting up bad guys is actually really easy, and there's a lot of synthetic fibers already on the market that could do that job pretty easily. But stopping the moving train, for instance, that's a lot harder because now you've got to actually stop this large momentum that's careening off of the tracks. But if you look at kind of, do the back of the hand calculations for how much silk might actually be coming out of his little silk shooters and compare that to the material property of spider silk, it's not unrealistic to think that, these cables of silk that are a couple inches thick might actually be able to stop a moving train. If you get into the nitty-gritty details of, well, okay, how much energy would it actually take a spider to produce that much silk that quickly, or what would you do with all of the energy that the silk basically has to dissipate as it stretches and that energy becomes heat? What would happen? Would it just blow up the silk? Would it catch on fire? That's where you get a little less realistic. But just the concept of being able to stop a moving train with silk, that's what silk is already doing every day in webs. The reason you're able to walk through a web, even though it's stronger than steel, is that these threads are so minute in size. A typical silk thread is about 1/100th the size of your own hair. And if it was as thick as typical steel wire, when you take your little walk through the park, you wouldn't just get a web in the face knocked over by it because you wouldn't be able to break it.
Yeah, as extreme as Spider-Man's feats seem, in the Marvel universe, it seems like actual spider silk is up to the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was again interesting in terms of the science is there, and when you look at movies and films, hopefully when they're based on something that's happening in reality, whether it's with animals or anything else, that the people researching it are kind of doing their due diligence on the background of it all to make sure the science holds up. But when you get into the superhero world, you're willing to take some things at faith level where you're just buying into this world where certain things can just happen. But knowing that the science is there, and it's just a matter of capacity and output and maybe even energy from a biological perspective, if it's an actual spider doing the production of this silk. But knowing that science is there to back up some of the things that we see on the big screen, that's huge. And it's also, as a layperson, I'm like, where's Spider-Man then? How come he's not out here just doing his thing yet already?
Yeah.
Seeing how we have materials even in the synthetic world that could even net and capture bad guys.
Yeah.
But I thought that was cool. The one knock on spiders though, or I don't want to hate on spiders, but I'm like, that's kind of whack. Like they can't projectile shoot their silk.
Yeah.
I don't know. Where evolution? Where are you? Step up.
Yeah.
How come we're not firing off? Is that not valid in certain environments?
Yeah. Step
I'm
the
not a
game
scientist,
up.
but
Get to tinkering.
Step the game up. Let's change it real quick. Let's take it up a notch.
Yeah. Give it another couple million years.
Right.
Maybe. Yeah. Or
what podcast episode will that be?
Yeah.
This just in.
Yeah.
We went back to Madagascar. They're shooting off spider webs. It's crazy out here.
Millions of years later.
Millions of years.
But also, I mean, there's also the off chance that there is a species that actually has some kind of projectile silk that that just hasn't been discovered yet.
And that may be more likely. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So I think I think that's where we're gonna we're gonna wrap it up for this particular episode, man. I think one of the things that I think is really interesting, some of the fantastical things that we read in comic books and science fiction, some of the things that we think may be completely absurd actually can have like somewhat of a biological basis, right? And having those two things feed each other, I think having fiction feed science and having science feed fiction, I think it brings both along. And I think we've seen that time and time again, whether it's issues of bioengineering, whether it's thought experiments about time travel. a lot of innovations that, that we see in science, especially like considering things like space travel, a lot of those innovations, you have to wonder if those things would have come along if it weren't for the science fiction that, scientists saw as kids or even even adults.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, man, this was an absolute blast. This is a great journey into the world of science. I think I learned a lot about science today. I think the people listening learned I didn't know a lot about science today, but we're all here in this journey together. Yeah, that's the cool thing. So we can all grow and learn together. But it is, again, I'll use the Venom term of symbiotic kind of relationship where both of these worlds inspire each other, whether it's, the comic sci-fi world or science itself. And in one way, we go to one place to get inspiration and get answers, and then we take the same path and vice versa and go to the other side to get inspiration and get answers or ideas for creativity to create the new superheroes of the day.
Yeah.
So, it's pretty cool. I'm excited you're doing this, man. Thank you for having me on the journey. I'd love to be a part of it again in the future.
And I would love to have you on again in the future. As a matter of fact, we only got through part of what I was hoping to get through this episode. Like maybe down the road we can extend it and do part 2 where we go in and explore a little bit more on the bioengineering side of things and talk to a bioengineer about exactly how engineers are using silks to to create innovative products for human use.
Sounds awesome, man. I'd love to do it.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for being on. I appreciate you.
All right. Cheers.
Peace. I really hope you enjoyed episode 1 of the Biology of Superheroes podcast. In episode 2, we'll continue our conversation about Peter Parker and Spider-Man, focusing on the engineering aspects of the character. I sit down with bioengineer Dr. John Klug and we chat about the real-life applications for spider silk, what it would take to design Spider-Man's custom web shooters, and I get his engineer's perspective on the character's origin story. If you like what you've heard so far, like us on Facebook, rate us on iTunes, and follow us on Instagram at The Biology of Superheroes Podcast. Send us your questions on Facebook or email us at biologyofsuperheroes@gmail.com, and we'll answer them throughout this series. And with that, I'll say thanks again, stay curious, and I'll catch you next month.